Before getting started, I just want to draw your attention that on Monday at 10 o'clock we are going to screen the movie The Forgotten Refugees, standing in on Monday, so if you would like to come after the meeting, please let me know. Michael Greenspan is going to be here, who's the director of the movie, and he's going to also answer the questions. And then, now to today's topic, it's a great pleasure to welcome and introduce Professor Robert Friedmann, who is a professor of criminal justice and distinguished chair of public safety partnerships at Georgia State University. His research interests and published work focus on community policing, terrorism, and crime analysis. His books include A Diary of 4 Years of Terrorism and Anti-Semitism in 2000-2004. Professor Friedmann is also a fellow Hungarian speaker, which is a great pleasure for me. But nobody should worry, he is not going to, even though he has all the capability, and I spoke to him in Hungarian, so he could speak in Hungarian today, but please no. Also in Hebrew, by the way. But we are going to stick with a regular language, which is English. So once again, it's a pleasure to welcome you, Professor. And our format is the usual. First we have the presentation, then we have time for discussion.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here with you. If you'll excuse my Hungarian Hebrew accent from Atlanta. And then ask what is a criminologist doing in a place like this. Hopefully after the half-hour presentation we have some sense, and I'll try to interject some personal interest in this as well. Okay, thank you. I was asked to talk about free speech and incitement. Manfred and I had several discussions on this, and that's how we got into this. I want to start with this notion of the word-deed continuum. It's a name that many of you, I'm sure, know. In 1945 said that words are deeds. And that's more than just saying that we think and then we do. This is words are deeds. About 10 years after that, John Austin, a linguist, in How to Do Things with Words, said the issuing of an utterance is the performing of an action. Okay? Now, from our own sources, Teah, chapter 1, chapter 4, look at this. A good thought is smelted by God into an action, namely that God will make sure to turn it into a good action, but the bad thought is not smelted by God into an action. He will prevent it from happening. I find this to be quite an interesting determinism, which of course is fairly unrealistic until we get to the United States legal system, and you'll see what they think, and you'll see how closely it's anchored in this idea. Just before I left the United States, I left about 6 days after this date, Memory issued one of the postings on the protocols of the Elders of Zion, that it's being now rehashed time and again in the Arab and Islamic world. And there are 3 examples here that include all of the elements of incitement and verification and hate speech. Kuwaiti daily is talking about the Zionist cockroach. The Syrian government daily was suggesting that the plan for world domination set out in the protocols is being implemented today. I haven't seen my bank account yet. By the way, when I go to Kroger, which is our supermarket, I always look for some blood of Christians on the shelves for Passover, and I can't find it. I'm not tempted enough to ask one of the salespeople because they won't understand that facetious humor. And the Egyptian daily, El Haram, says a recent event in the Middle East, including the inevitable clash between Iran and Israel, are part of the Zionist plan to establish a Jewish kingdom to rule the world. Now, this is the incitement. Not that long ago, there was an interview with Shazli, who was the former chief of staff of the Egyptian military, who said, eventually we will win. Namely, there's going to be another war with Egypt, okay? Between Egypt and Israel, and we will win. So, again, the deed and the talk. Now, since I was in Egypt, I had, I'm saying I had, is still alive, but an Egyptian colleague who is now president of Northeastern University in the United States, and he was Dean of Arts and Sciences for many years, and we were actually very good friends. And I've seen Egyptian publications that are horrible imitations or now originals of, what you would see in the Stirmer. And I've seen them first in 1967 in the Sinai in Egyptian camps when I looked at some of the personal effects of Egyptian soldiers and found some of these, their Stirmer-like magazines with the hooked nose and the Star of David trying to crush, the poor Arab and all this stuff. And I've said, how come that El Haram publishes this stuff? This is a government newspaper, and he dismissed it. He says, this is, it's done by fools. It's not serious. I said, it's very serious. Well, finally, before he left for another post, and his brother is a minister in the Egyptian government, he sort of half admitted that it's condoned, if not encouraged by the government. My personal experience with anti-Semitism, other than studying and learning about it, is that I saw Nazis marching under my window when I lived in Minneapolis for my doctoral studies, and there was a TV series, Shoah, and it really disturbed the sensitivities of the Nazis, and they marched to protest that. And I will tell you, to see Nazis marching, it's beyond the pale. I mean, I could not fathom it. I mean, you see it in a movie, suddenly you see them under your window. I lived in a high-rise, so they were not really under my window. I mean, 13th floor. And who was arrested? The Jews who protested the Nazis' march. Okay? Well, this was the indirect experience, but my first direct experience was exactly 2 months ago, when I spoke to a senior university. It's a university of retired people, professors, lawyers, doctors, accountants, former military, an educated audience, which is sometimes a problem. And the retired chair of political science at my university, who was in that position for 15, probably too many years, at the end of a presentation on the tension and conflict and where we're going with this, raises his hand. His was the last question, and he says, what you did here is exactly what Hitler did. So when I'm being put on the spot, I said to him, do you mind running this by me again? Did I understand you correctly? Of course I understood him correctly. And he says, yes, you are vilifying all of the Muslims as all of them are bad, which is exactly what I did not do, by the way. And I said, Glenn, you were sitting in this lecture the same way that I was speaking here. Weren't you listening? Oh, you showed a map that shows that they want to conquer the world. I said, it's not my map. It's a map of an Islamist organization that was taken from the web. I was very troubled by it. I had an exchange with Nachman on this, and you have an educated person who was the chair of the Department of Political Science, and he's disturbed by something that I didn't do. Okay, so obviously not the first time that happens. All right, so now let's talk a little bit about the First Amendment. As many of you know, it's the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. That's where we have the right of free speech, and there are two cases that I want to briefly mention. The first one is Brandenburg versus Ohio in 1969. This was a KKK type person who uttered vengeance against Jews, blacks, government shouldn't be accommodated. And the Supreme Court it turned down the lower court decision and found that this speech is protected because there was no evidence that it explicitly advocated unlawful conduct. Explicitly advocated unlawful conduct. And also that the conduct was not likely to follow imminently from the speech. The word imminence is key in understanding the legal approach in the United States to freedom of speech. 6 years later, Hess versus Indiana. This is a statement that was made by Hess. Usually when you see it, you only see the F and a few dots, but this is what he said. And the Supreme Court decided that this speech is protected because it was not directed to a specific person. In other words, you can say basically whatever you want. You can say, you know, kill the Jews, it's okay, but you know, if you say kill Rabbi Friedman, I may have a legal argument against it, and I might even win if I will be still living. And there was no evidence that the speech intended to produce disorder. Now, I'm a criminologist, I'm not a lawyer, so you read into it whatever you like. This is the status now of the legal ruling by the Supreme Court, which tends to be interpreting this into what I would say the extreme lenience towards protecting the right of free speech. So when we talk about incitement, the court is looking for several components. Intent, namely intent to do harm, that there's an imminence that harm will result from the talk, that it is likely to happen. Okay? So advocacy of a violent doctrine is protected under the US law unless it is inciting to produce imminent lawless action and is likely to incite or produce such action. Here is a case where the Supreme Court did not allow free speech. This was a case of a publisher who published a how-to book for hate killings. And one person was actually shot based on the how-to manual that was provided by the publisher, and the publisher was told that you cannot publish a book like this, and so it's not always in favor of, you know, everything is allowed. To some extent, free speech is regulated. There's regulation of core political speech. For example, you cannot do it in commercial enterprises. You cannot do it in UPS headquarters. You cannot do political speech because it's a private property. Speech that incites for illegal and subversive activities, you cannot do that. There are fighting words that you cannot use. In a sense, the whole notion of shouting fire in a theater, that's where it's coming from. Obscenity and pornography is not allowed, and of course that's all depending on interpretations, because you can find it anywhere that if you want to pay for it or get it free. There's some symbolic speech that is regulated. Commercial speech is regulated. And interestingly enough, student speech is regulated by universities. However, it is not exactly protected by courts, as I'll point out later. I also wanted to put up here what is hate speech in the United States, because when you look at it, almost everything is a hate speech, because you can't even be a full-time comedian, because obviously you're going to insult somebody. And if you look at what is going to be insulting or hateful speech, if you look at this, anything, you know, gender, age, ethnicity, nationality, religion, sexual orientation, gender identity, disability, and the list is long. There's a joke in the Foreign Service, anywhere, that when you go out on a mission, there are three things you don't talk about, and that is sex, politics, and religion. And then the cadet says, and what else is there to talk about? So, I mean, when you look at this, everything could be defined as hate speech. And interestingly enough, the First Amendment prohibits the government from regulating it, except for defamation or incitement to riot. And even in cases where it encourages illegal violence, the instances of incitement qualify for, you know, to be defined as criminal only if the threat is imminent. Now, I'm sure that to this audience I don't need to say that imminence in 1933 took 6 years. You know, the court here is talking about imminence, that it happens in the next few minutes, or maybe the next day, or the next week. I would tend to define imminence in the larger timeline. And as I mentioned, in public universities, speech codes have not fared well in the court because they are frequently overturned as unconstitutional. Now, to the topic that I want to touch on, relating the incitement to and genocide to that. Is the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda tried 3 media executives and convicted them in 2003. because the ruling was that the defendant's crime was to spread petrol, that's the British word for oil, throughout the country little by little, so that one day they will be able to set fire to the whole country. Okay. Each modern case of genocide has been preceded by some propaganda campaign transmitted via mass media and directed by a handful of political leaders. It's quite interesting that it was Rwanda. I haven't seen a lot of international tribunals about a lot of other kinds of violations, but in this case, what's important is that they were convicted on incitement. Okay? And the claim, the judges claim that when hate speech incites, it does so because the listener is receptive to such speech, and then through the media that they use, the incitement is a critical causal element, as if we didn't know that, in genocide, as people do not spontaneously rise up to kill en masse. And before genocide can occur, a large number of people must come to condone killing or look the other way, and so on and so forth. Now, interestingly enough, Julius Streicher was the first one that was convicted for incitement in the Nuremberg trials in 1945, I believe. Now, incitement in international law is codified as direct and public incitement to genocide. As you can see, direct is a bit of a problem. What is direct? It's not really defined. I think it opens up some loopholes as to how to define it. The Rwanda, here's the actual ruling of the Rwanda verdict, and they said that direct and public incitement did not refer exclusively to a speaker, but any use of any media, whether it's printed, electronic, TV, radio, so on and so forth. Any audiovisual communication. So here's some limitations of the First Amendment in the United States. Okay? Virulent and even violent speech is protected in the US in the belief that the public discourse will contain it, that bad speech will eventually be mitigated by good speech. Does that remind you of the first slide of the Talmud? That's exactly the market of ideas. In this case, the market of ideas replaces the law of God, but it's the same principle. And maybe it works for the United States. I'm not so sure. What I am sure about is that the US is willing to pay the price to uphold this kind of an approach. But I don't see, for example, this marketplace of ideas taking place in Iran, for example, in today's reality. And again, the direct issue and the imminent danger is highly problematic. So, I'm a criminologist. I don't know how many of you heard the concept of broken windows, but the whole idea is if you have one broken window which in a neighborhood is not taken care of, that sends a message that you don't really care about your neighborhood, and then you can, if you break another window and then you start throwing trash, and then you start selling drugs, and then the whole neighborhood goes down. So the idea is to fix that first broken window, not to allow that continuum of decay to take place. In other words, and there's another joke, and I don't know if I'm not politically correct, so I can say that. The story is about this guy who walks in the desert, and he's very thirsty and hungry, and he's not exactly educated, doesn't know what to do. Suddenly he sees the railroad track. And he goes on the track, and it's much more convenient walking on the tracks than walking on the sand dunes. And he walks, and he's getting tired and hungry and thirsty, and he hears a whistle. And he looks around, and he doesn't see anything. So he continues to walk, and he looks around, and by that time it was too late, because the train that came from around the hill took his leg that was stuck in the track. Well, years later, he sits in the kitchen, and his wife puts some water to boil for tea. And this new kettle that she just bought starts whistling when the water is hot. And he stands up and limps on his wooden leg, goes to the stove, takes the tea kettle down, stomps over it with his wooden leg, beats it with his cane. His wife looks at it and says, "What are you doing? I just bought this new one today." He says, "You have to kill this bastard with that small." Now, that's the whole idea of broken windows. You have to start it early on. So if you apply broken windows to the word deed axis, what is an issue is that oftentimes in the court it's a matter of interpretation. And it beats me that in Germany it's illegal to trade and to disseminate Nazi merchandise, but in the United States it is legal, so that from Lincoln, Nebraska, they export the Nazi garbage to Germany because the Germans cannot do that. Okay?
That they can import it?
They,
Is it legal to import it?
no,
Germany?
it's illegal to handle it, it's illegal to display it, but my point is that it's definitely illegal to merchandise it. And the Americans don't know better, they don't know what the Nazis already did. You need another example to show it. So it's an issue. Okay? What's important, we always talk about incitement, but I wanted to put on the continuum because incitement is not the first in the chronological order. First you have some elements of hate. For example, if you look today at things that you can find 3-4 times a day in any publications, from the Palestinian Authority to official Egyptian and Syrian and Saudi and other kinds of from Hamas to Hezbollah, Jews educate children to hate, kill Arabs. I was educated in the Israeli system. I just failed that class. I don't remember being educated to do that. Okay? Vilification. Now that you've said that they do this, now let's look who they are. So it's cancer, dead fish, stinking corpse, or the Goebbels type, the Untermensch. Once you get to that level, then you say, what can we do to them? Okay? Let's dehumanize them. They're sons of apes and pigs. We hear that time and time again. And after the dehumanization, the hate, vilification, then the incitement comes. Okay? Israel will be wiped out. Okay? Now we hear that from a head of state who threatens Israel with nuclear weapons, which he doesn't have, he doesn't need, because it's all for providing electrical grids. And all of the satellite pictures show nuclear facilities, but there are no grids to take the nuclear power to the cities, so it's kind of interesting. And of course, hence the danger to violence, but not simply violence on the streets, but violence that leads to genocide. And it's amazing that after such a short few decades following the Holocaust, in my generation, both my parents survived Auschwitz, and to see this kind of hate, vilification, and incitement in our generation is almost unfathomable. Okay, so 4 minutes left. Here are some of the limitations of the justice system. And I will say that if you want to fight terrorism and genocide, there are limitations to what the justice system can do. But yet it needs to be taken advantage in order to do what it can do. But it's slow, it's after the fact. Nuremberg and Rwanda happened after the most horrible barbarities that no words can describe. They're subject to time, space, interpretation, what is imminent. Right? And absolutely, or they're likely unable to prevent it. And I want to sort of suggest this. Police do not need permission from murderers to arrest them. Okay? The free world should not seek permission from those inciting genocide from within or from without. It doesn't matter whether Ahmadinejad says it in Tehran or he says it in any of the countries that host him. He should have a warrant for his arrest. He should not be a free person. And incitement and genocide should be outlawed. So as you can see, I still have a belief in the justice system. And with that, thank you, and be glad to open it up. Here's my contact information, and I'll be glad to open it up for question, discussion, answer.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Aaron Lopez.
Just wanted to take, first of all, thank you very much for really very enlightening presentation.
Last week, one of the Israeli Arab members of Knesset had claimed that actually Ehud Barak just listened to classical music while ordering the killing or murdering of Arab children. Such a sentence will be controlled?
That's not incitement, that's vilification.
Okay.
Okay, and it's not one of the worst sentences that that member of parliament has said. I mean, I'm not an expert on the Israeli legal system, but I think that in Israel, like in many Western countries, we bend way backwards to way too ill, so to speak. One is the desire to fight that kind of behavior, and the desire to prevent perhaps a worse outcome if you outlaw that kind of speech. And that is sort of a dynamic that we see existing all the time. I think that the longer we wait, I'm not familiar with a lot of societies where you have MPs that will vilify their own country and their own elected representatives to the extent that that example and many others.
Are there, your last example, especially and now what you just touched on, are there any limitations in the justice system, particularly democratic countries, to diplomatic immunity, either of domestic legislators or of foreign diplomats?
From what I know, and there are experts here that are far more knowledgeable than I am, there's the universal jurisdiction. Countries that claim universal jurisdiction can prosecute, or you can submit charges or petitions against military persons or politicians who visit. And we've seen it in Belgium a while back, we've seen it in England, and I don't know to what extent the British system is going to change its legislation. I mean, all of this stuff, it takes time. It's not going to happen next Monday by any means. I don't know what's more effective or whether it's mutually exclusive, but I would say that I've started to see some evidence that in Belgium, actually, there are some Israelis or Israeli citizens or Belgian citizens who are now trying to submit these kinds of petitions and charges against Hamas or other kinds of activists and return fire. I think you fight fire with fire in that regard. I don't know to what extent we can prevent a country from submitting these kinds of charges against us.
Professor Katler, would you like to say something on the last point?
No, first of all, that under the Genocide Convention, direct and public incitement to genocide is prohibited, but the Genocide Convention specifically says that even heads of state that engage in incitement to genocide are not immune from prosecution.
The Sudan president.
But his was on war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, not incitement. But in matters of incitement, the Rwanda case law, where it dealt with the Rwandan president, they said there's no immunity because incitement to genocide is a prosecutable offense even against heads of state.
Thank you. Dr. Rosenthal?
Thanks a lot.
I just wonder how we go from here to turn it into an instrument which Israelis can use.
Well, again, if I wear my criminologist hat, the biggest development in the policing movement is community policing in the last 25 plus years. I'm not going to be the judge on how effective it is and what are some of the issues, but one of the key elements in it is being proactive. I think being reactive and waiting for things to happen and then waking up, sometimes to a fact that is not easy to change on the ground. I mean, we have known all of these realities of charges against us, not just when Yalon wanted to go to London and canceled, or Limni wanted to go to London and canceled. It happened against Almog 2 years ago, or last year, whenever that was, and previously as well. I think that there ought to be some sort of a governmental policy, whether it's led by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or the Prime Minister's office, but the notion of lawfare, if you will, of fighting it in the same way. I mean, if somebody wants to take an Israeli to court because of supposed war crimes, if these are war crimes, what exactly is what Hamas or Hezbollah are doing? I mean, that is, I have on my webpage, I have the quotes of the Geneva Convention. It is absolutely prohibited to shoot from within civilian population against civilian population. I haven't seen anybody that prosecuted on that.
They're non-state actors.
Goldstone,
They're non-state actors.
You don't have to be a state
You
actor.
don't have to be.
Don't have to be a state.
Absolutely not. Absolutely
you're
not.
responsible for territory, not for only for
It's in
people.
fact your duty and obligation to protect your citizens, and you are allowed to shoot. I mean, what Israel has done is legal. I mean, it's sad, but human being is killed. You know, it's sad, but you know, to learn morality and legal standards from Hamas, I think is a bit ridiculous.
Mr. Goldstone won't come out.
Well, it's the UN in the service of Hamas.
Yeah, but look, it's not one issue. It's not about an issue thing that, I mean, before Al-Mawq we had Sharon, and Sharon ended not because of the dramatic efficiency of the foreign ministry, but because of the Belgian mistake to try it out on a few Americans who had better answers than we, and which were also not, you didn't have to change the law for the Americans because they were taking NATO out of Brussels. Then the law changed by itself almost. So you have here a structural problem for Israel. We cannot be in the forefront of righting all the wrongs in a postmodern system in the world.
Could I ask Manfred on this? That I'm chairman of the British Zionist Federation, just to explain, so we're looking at this lawfare quite carefully. What is the difference, Manfred, between Britain and other European countries? I know Belgium is supposed to have changed the law because of NATO. Spain is supposed to be, but it's being appealed because of De Cuellar. But why is it not subject to the EU or having a consistent policy? Is France different, Germany different, or they're just not enforcing it? That's what, I mean, we're looking at this.
Look, I am not a lawyer, but it is clear that the attitude of countries is extremely different. The Spaniards have some background with Latin America. I think it's Pinochet, that is one Judge Garzon or whatever his name is, who proceeds with these things. The question is whether, for some countries, Belgium now changed it against the objection of the socialists, who are fairly big enemies of us, that it has to have some relation to your country. It can be universal law, but if this is something which happened against a Canadian in France, then you are not supposed to deal with it. If a Belgian citizen came to harm, or a Belgian criminal was involved, then even if it takes place out of your country, you can do it. But this is a whole field in flux, and another 500 fields in flux. And we are not built to deal even with one field in flux. And that is the essence, because you all know this better than I know, because we are not in, we only are in physical war, we are not in propaganda war, that is privatized in this country and left over to a number of individuals and friends and organizations. So you always come back to the basic. To the basic issue, there is no brain here which recognizes these problems, which is even thinking about them. It's already dramatically progressive that after 9 years of a propaganda intifada, which started with Al-Dura almost the day after physical intifada, that we have a prime minister who mentions the code word Goldstone, which really means that we have to do anything against propaganda warfare. It took 9 years. So we start from nowhere.
I'd like to say, I agree, and I think you touched on a very important point when you spoke about the need for proactivity.
Can't hear.
I think that Professor Friedman had an important point when he spoke about the need for proactivity. Sort of as background, Zev Schiff, who was Israel's leading military analyst, wrote about 3 years ago that it was Israel's greatest defeat that it never reacted to the missiles which came out of Gaza and let the problem fester for so long. And this, of course, was ignored. Let's say 7 years ago, 8 years ago, if Israel had reacted forcefully, just as in the same case with the terrorists who ambushed the settler, maybe the outcome would have been different. I think maybe the mentality is not to appreciate, we have a blind spot to appreciate these points, you know, to have to kill the tea kettle before it becomes an engine.
Well, I'll say this. In Israel, when you have a shooting that is likely to involve a casualty, namely, you don't just shoot at a building or a vehicle, but human beings, soldiers are likely to die, you have a chain of command that you have to go through from the field all the way sometimes up to the Prime Minister's office. And then the decision is oftentimes political. And for years, since the establishment of the state, the policy of the Ministry of Defense was, we'll wait until the cup fills and then we'll go out to a big operation. I tend to agree with you. It's a mistake, although you have to choose your battles carefully and you can't always react on you know, it's very hard to manage the politics of warfare when you have elections on the mind.
I would just take it further. I think we have a blind spot because the people who make the decisions are soldiers and they don't see the political dimension of it. And this time, let's say, it came up and bit us.
When I was a reserve officer on the Golan Heights, I was in the liaison office to the United Nations, and I had to accompany a peacekeeping observer so that he doesn't stray from his route and go into areas that he's not supposed to. When I got back, the line, what is known as the green line, is up to 1,500 meters on the ground. The Syrians claim that the 1,500 meters end here. Israel claims that the 1,500 meters end here, and the UN is in the middle. So what the Syrians do is they send intelligence officers under the guise of being shepherds, 200 meters. Israel does nothing. 400 meters, it does nothing. 600 meters, and they continue to test the patience. And when I got back, I had 3 soldiers from that platoon who were ready to shoot. And I said, you can't shoot until you get permission. Well, I called the command, the Northern Command, and we did not get permission to shoot. So the actual end result is that the Syrians have learned that.
The question of Friedmann, please.
I have 2 very different questions. The first question relates to Ahmadinejad and the difference between calling for genocide and calling for staticide. It seems to me that he never calls for the destruction of the Jewish people, and in fact claims that Jews are his friends, and we know Notori Carter visits him and everything like this. He calls for the destruction of the state of Israel. He doesn't even directly threaten that he's going to use nuclear arms, which he doesn't even admit that he's developing. So how do you deal with this? That's one question. The second is, I would like to know something about the local atmosphere at Georgia State University in relation to the horrifying change that has occurred in the world in which everything is seen upside down. It's not a dramatic overnight change, but it's a change in which the worst terrorist nations in the world accuse one nation of we know the situation. We all know the situation. How does that, and we know the shift in the United States, which has occurred in the academic world. Can you speak to that reality in some way?
Very, very briefly, Georgia State has really changed its face until about 10 years ago. It was an urban university commuting campus. And after the Olympics, we inherited 2,000 dorm spaces, and now students are living actually downtown and with growing numbers. So student life is starting to be quite evident on campus. There is what I would call political activity, and I think that it is being directed from without, not from within. It's very well funded, it's part of a network. I can tell you there's a group that is called the Progressive Student Alliance, and I got an email from them that they're interested with my ties to Israel, and they have concerns about it. And I went to their website, they don't know that I did that, and I found out that what they're concerned about is apartheid Israel, and they're concerned about police terrorism. Namely, they look at police as being terrorizing in any country, not just in Israel. And I'm yet to meet with them because I asked them to specify what the concerns are, and they're not specifying it, and I'm not meeting with them until they will do. This is the first time in 24 years that I've been there that I've seen this kind of conduct that is starting to be more blatant, but it's extremely well funded by sources outside of the university. I've never seen a student organization that sophisticated before. And for Georgia State, that's an innovation. And I'm saying that because it's a very conservative environment.
Black, lot of black students?
The majority of the population is 60-40 black. The campus is about 30 to 40% black, which is the highest in any state university in Georgia. I'll probably leave it to Aaron to handle the first question, because he probably knows about it more than I do.
No, just on the first point, the notion that Ahmadinejad only attacks the state of Israel does not attack the Jews is wrong. In fact, there are statements by the supreme leader, the Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, repeated by Ahmadinejad, to the effect that there is no solution to the Arab-Israeli conflict other than the annihilation of the Jewish state. It's very clear, and then all the epidemiological metaphors that refer to the removal of this cancerous tumor, this microbe, this bacteria. I mean, I can tell you as somebody who prosecuted Rwandans for incitement to genocide, that there are more incitement precursors to genocide in Ahmadinejad's Iran than there were in Rwanda. And so the evidence is clear.
But what you said is still against the state, not the people.
No, it's against the people.
The regime. Eradicate the state.
No, first of all, you can't eradicate a state without also eradicating its people.
Okay, you have to make that move, though. You have to make that
But that's
introduction.
clear in the jurisprudence also. In other words, the references in Rwanda, it wasn't to go ahead and kill the Tutsis. It was references to the Tutsis as cockroaches. It was reference to them as falashes. The courts interpreted that as being a clear invitation to do away with them and the use of euphemisms. The language does not have to be specifically calling for the genocide, though in Iran, the evidentiary base is so comprehensive and compelling that there's almost no other like genre of incitement anywhere. It just, as we identified in this petition, when we put out 8 precursors, incitement precursors to genocide in Ahmadinejad's Iran. And as I said, there's no parallel. The other interesting question is what Manfred brought. If that is happening, and it's prohibited under the Genocide Convention, and state parties under the Genocide Convention are mandated, it's not a policy option, are mandated, legally required to combat it and prevent it, why hasn't one state party under the Genocide Convention undertaken any of the legal remedies which exist under international law to combat it, including the United Kingdom, which is a state party to the Genocide Convention, which tomorrow can initiate an interstate complaint before the International Court of Justice against Iran, which is also a state party to the Genocide Convention. So the issue is not the absence of law or legal remedy, or even the absence of evidence. regarding incitement to genocide. The real issue is political will.
Yes,
And this political will is lacking in the international community.
thank you.
Is it something that we could ask for them to do?
Absolutely.
Can you tell me what to do?
Yeah.
No, we'll approach them.
The answer must be that they still think they can have dialogue with them, but therefore do not want to prosecute them because they'll ride off into the sunset, daft as it may be. That must be the lack of political will or political judgment. That this is why they haven't. Nobody's done it, but maybe the crowd has done it. Because the deadline's gone, but there's still dialogue.
But you know, I'll tell you something, the same way, but I have found with political leaders in different countries, they don't know that they're obliged under the Genocide Convention to do this, and they don't know the evidence that exists in respect of which they are obliged to implement these legal norms. Political leaders live in a bubble. They don't know. And you'd be surprised if you go ahead and ask the leadership of the United Kingdom, they say, oh, we didn't know that this is going on, and we didn't know we're obliged to do this. If you tell them this, and then they don't do it, then...
Very happy to do that.
Yeah.
I mean, we've got the excuse of Baroness Scotland was here, the Attorney General was here.
Yeah, she's very good, actually.
I don't think she's been there.
No, I said she's very good on a lot of these issues.
Okay,
If
very
it's-
happy to raise it. Very happy to.
The lawyers don't tell them, I mean, they don't think. But they have lawyers, they have the legal department. They don't know it.
Not inherited.
Dr. Friedman, have you seen the impact of the new Obama administration on how they view these kinds of issues? Are they more aggressive, less aggressive? There's a lot of static. I've been trying to kind of know what's going on. You're here full time. How do you see this? What's the impact?
Well, I'm gravitating in different circles. For example, I'm a board member of the Jewish Federation in Atlanta, so I hear what the Jewish leadership is talking as if it's a monolithic entity. It's not. I hear key leaders in the law enforcement community, Homeland Security, police, military, National Guard. I can tell you that in the police, in the military, usually in conservative circles, I'm not suggesting Republican, but in conservative circles, there is a sentiment that ranges from disgust to being baffled by the misunderstanding of what the administration is doing, whether it's bowing to a Saudi king or whether there's suddenly the man-made disasters, because you cannot talk about terrorism. Terrorism is clearly a man-made disaster, but when you have a euphemism and you take that away, you take the power and the urgency of dealing with that. I also see that, I've been following American politics since I was about 10 years old, but I will say that I have never seen a president that was elected, got into office, and within 8 months, there's already loud discussion about him being a one-termer. Whether that will be happening or whether it's wishful thinking, I don't know. But he has taken so many balls to juggle, from the economy towards the war on terrorism, which is my word, not his, and then the health reform, which, by the way, has not passed. It's still in conference, and it's hard to know what the ramification will be. If he fails to pass that, that's likely going to be his demise, because he was banking on it. There may be some kind of an accord reached, but the gap is just amazing. If they're able to conference it out, that's going to be close to a miracle. There are things that he's doing that are quite strange. You look, for example, at his reaction to the Massachusetts police behavior in the case of the black professor, where he says they behaved stupidly. Now, I will tell you that the person who was vilified that way teaches civil rights to police officers. The sergeant that was vilified that way and then was invited to the beer party in the White House. I mean, that is a careless, for a lawyer to be so careless in making that remark, but see, in politics you can have the cake and eat it, because he can say that and then he say, I didn't mean it. So he achieved the effect of having said it, and then achieved the effect of more or less taking his words back. Now you look at what he said about Al Hassan in Fort Hood. He said, let's not jump into judgment. Let's not rush into judgment. I mean, he rushed into judgment in the Massachusetts case because there was a black professor. Now, because it's a Muslim perpetrator, let's not rush into judgment. Beyond all of that, what really concerns me is that if you look at the case of whether it's homegrown or imported kinds of terrorism in the United States, I would say that in the United States I should use the term that we use often in Israel, that some people have more luck than brains, because the fact that they have not been more successful with their attempts is absolutely amazing, and they will probably have another pyrotechnic success in the near future. Whether it's going to happen in 2 weeks or 2 months or 2 years, I don't know, but they are constantly trying.
Yeah, going back to the broken windows concept, much simpler example, I think was the brilliant action of Mayor Rudy Giuliani in New York, and it was a horrible situation, terrible crime and dirt and all kinds of bad things going on. And he used that principle exactly as it was spelled out with great, great success. I think they've slipped back a little bit since then.
Yes.
That was one thing.
Yes.
And the other thing was that what you told us about the Green Line in Syria, it would seem to me that these IDF officers who were making policy were worried about the political correctness, just like the people in Fort Hood with the Nissan Hassan, who you mentioned, was also the people who were investigating him were terrorized by political correctness, losing their jobs, and so on and so on. So, yeah.
Well, I don't know about that specific case, whether there were the military officers who didn't receive the permission or there were politicians who didn't allow the shooting to take place. Because you know what happens is that if the Israelis would have shot, it would have been a black mark in the United Nations certificate or diploma that we receive on an occasional basis, and then it's a bad point, and we don't get we get negative credit for that. The issue of Giuliani, and I'm glad that you mentioned it because it shows how complicated life is. It is actually not Giuliani who did that, it's Bill Bratton, who was his police commissioner, who did that. And Giuliani kicked him out because on the cover of Time magazine, Bratton was the only one on the picture, and he forgot who his partner was. That was the mayor. So, in addition to the policing part that he did, what he actually did was the urban renewal and the improvement district it's in the Times Square area and other places. So it's a combination of proactive economic development that changed the landscape along the lines of broken windows, but by no means would I mean, there are people here who say it's Giuliani, and for the purpose of convenience, I will say that. And by the way, if I'll be allowed one transgression, when I bring delegations of police chiefs to Israel, and we've met with Olmert when he was the mayor of Jerusalem, he says, I want to have police like Giuliani. And I said, no, you don't. And Mayor Friedmann wants to have municipal police. In Israel, it's a very bad idea. Very bad idea.
Howard, Iceland and Edward.
What's the, a bit different question, what's the level of Jimmy Carter influence in Georgia? What's the level of Jimmy Carter influence in Georgia, and
in Georgia?
In Georgia, and amongst academia, amongst the public, etc., media, and particularly his quote unquote al-Chet. How's that accepted by the Jewish community, by the Jewish leadership in Georgia?
Look, I'll say it for whatever it's worth, no offense meant to anyone. Jewish leadership in the South typically keeps a low profile. And some of it is done quite smartly, because you don't want to have a tempest in a teapot if you can let the waves somehow shy and move away. However, that's not the case with Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter is an egotist, frustrated politician who takes it out on the Jews because he was not re-elected for a second term, and he said it so. Okay? I demanded that our federation send him a letter when he was interviewed after the Geneva Accord in a full-page New York Times, and I'm quoting almost verbatim. At the end, his last sentence was, I regret that I was not re-elected for a second term because I could have used my influence with the leadership in the area to work towards the final solution. Now, you can say that he's stupid. You can say that he's stupid, you can say that he's ignorant, or you can say that he's malicious. Don't tell me that the former president doesn't know that that's a loaded term for Jews. Well, after the book Apartheid, then several of the Jewish leaders, including some academics, resigned. 15 years way too late. What is happening now is far more interesting, by the way, as far as the Jewish community is concerned, because his grandson is running for an office that is being vacated by David Edelman, who is being given an appointment by the Obama administration as the ambassador in Singapore. And Edelman probably thinks, geez, am I not being promoted? No, you're being kicked out of the way to allow the young Jimmy to get into it. That's the story. Now, I am not so sure. Carter, of course, denies it.
None of
Now,
this is written up.
there are several articles, and I'm sure you've seen them. There are several circulating, but I don't buy that al-Khet for a single second. For those who do, I have a bridge to sell. It is just absolutely outrageous because he says, I just feel that I've said a few things that are hurtful, more or less, in these words. Well, take them back. Say that what you have done in that book is unacceptable. And what is wrong? He didn't do that. And he will not do that. So, how much influence he has, in Georgia, really not much. In Georgia politics, not much. But he clearly wants to pave the way for his grandson to gain access to political office.
I was going to ask Erwin Cotter a question. He's gone, so. I mean, I'll just say what I was going to ask. One was, I seem to remember that he and a group of other people, I think, Elie Wiesel amongst them, were taking legal action against Iran. And I would have liked to ask him about the status of that litigation. And secondly, we talked about the experience of various countries, what they were doing. He mentioned the UK, etc. But he knows about Canada, and I would like to hear what Canada did or didn't do.
Well, I can't talk much about Canada. Erwin can do it much better than I can. In the United States, let's take it away for a second from Israel. The notion of the big Satan and the small Satan plays in this game this way. The Americans have an understanding that if Israeli officers and politicians are going to be charged in international court, they're going to be next. And they understand it. That's one of the reasons that I think the Americans are trying to help. I am not, again, not being an attorney and not understanding the intricacies of the legal system. I don't have a claim to fame to know where exactly the litigation is or what is the American administration doing. At this point, everybody's trying to be nice and play nice with everybody. My advice to the administration in general is what I call the Kmart principle. I go to Kmart, I don't want to wed the cashier. All I want is to have a transaction. I don't want to have a love affair with somebody who just sells me something and takes my money. If you want to be nice, when a president says they are our friends, of course not. There are no friendships in politics. There are political interests of the state. And it depends, it remains to be seen what are now the political interests of the United States. I do not see, whether it's in Europe, particularly not in Europe, in Latin American hemisphere, God forbid, being liked is not working. That approach that the administration is taking now is really not paying any dividends. And what frightens me, and I think think Manfred and I had one exchange to that extent, is that maybe the world eventually will do the right thing, but why not adopt the business approach of doing it with a reasonable cost rather than paying much more dearly for it later? I mean, if the Second World War would have stopped with the invasion to Czechoslovakia, if not before, not only that, many of our families would have still, been alive, metaphorically speaking and physically speaking, but about 60 million or so people lives would have been spared. And it raises some question of why, and without mentioning the names, the raison d'etre for my book on terrorism and anti-Semitism was when somebody told me that the initial steps of the Intifada, which is the wrong term to use, was just public disorder and the Israel police will take care of it within 3 days to 3 weeks. And I have it black and white in 2001, in 2000, October 2000 actually, where I said, no, it's going to take at least 3 years. Why wait and why pay that price? Yes, we built a fence after 1,000 people died. These are the issues. I mean, so now I'd rather wait another hour and be checked at the airport than being blown away on a flight. But there are a lot of people who say, oh, geez, you're invading my privacy.
What about that privacy in America after Detroit? Do you think Americans will change the selection process?
I would say, even if they will, it's fairly irrelevant because there is no system that is foolproof. I can tell you that in this system that everybody now is talking about, where you sort of show up semi-naked on a screen, you've seen those pictures, I can tell you how to smuggle stuff, but most of you are after lunch, so I'm not going to do it. There are ways to do that. So that system is really not as clean, and if somebody wants to commit it, they can. The problem, I think, is quite different. It's not the willingness of the technicians to have a good defense system, it's the willingness of society to have a good defense system. And I think that the West in general doesn't have it. And it's a harsh statement to make, because I've written one article about 10 years ago about the need to have some measure of accommodation between freedom of expression, freedom of choice, freedom of personal liberties, and security. Because if we will not have that accommodation, we'll end up not having liberty and we will not have security. And in a society like ours, and there's a British police officer who's pretty well known in the literature, John Alderson, who talked about the dilemmas of police and freedom. We want to police a free society as if a terror threat is not there. But we want to provide security as if we're living in East Germany, and people don't want to live in a society like this. And to some extent, the Americans have yet to grapple with the issue of privacy and liberty. I had arguments with the ACLU, and I've had a panel where I said to the ACLU representative, "You're representing an obsolete organization," to which she was looking at me, "How can you say that?" I said, "Well, let me ask you, what is the most important value in society?" She says, "Liberties and freedom." I said, "No, it's not the most important. The most important is life." And the human rights organizations are police and EMS and firefighters, because they protect life. And if you have life, now we can talk about protecting privacy. We need to have some balance there, and I don't see that.
I'd like to make a remark. You said, that the societies are not prepared to make the sacrifices. I would suggest something else. The problem, for example, both with President George W. Bush and Obama, was that they refused to acknowledge that America was really at war and to ask for sacrifices from the public. And
yeah, that's true.
And the leadership was faulty. And you see, society is very abstract, but there is an address.
Well, the message for George Bush was, go and buy, which means, life is normal. You can't really say that life is normal under those circumstances. Although I must tell you that the difference in Israel is that when you have a pigua, the cell phones, immediately go up, and then you find out that your loved ones are okay, people continue to move on. It's very difficult to live in constant tension all the time. It's not.
Look, if you have in the West, United States, Canada, Western Europe, you have 600 million people there. And how difficult it is to live with a plane of 300 people being blown up every 6 months. Not that you are statistical. Nobody argues this rational. But how about your statistical chance compared to endless other risks?
Well, what will happen is that if another plane or 2 or 10 blows up, it can stop interstate and international commerce. It is going to be devastating economically, not just in terms of the human lives. I'm not so sure that if it becomes one of the questions that I'm being asked time and again when I address homeland security issues is, how come we didn't have a terrorist attack in the United States? And I say, you mean outside of 9/11? What they mean is the coffee shops, the buses, the malls, and all of that stuff. But actually, it's happening. It's not
Yeah, but still.
Not to the extent that it's here.
No, but that's a different thing. 1,000 deaths in Israel is a totally different ballgame than 1,000 deaths in the rest of the world. From the order of magnitude. What are your chances, nobody reasons like that, what are your chances to die by a terrorist attack today as a Westerner?
Very small.
I mean, it doesn't make the list of the 100 major death risks.
No. Swine flu is more dangerous, actually.
Everything is almost more dangerous. Rare diseases are more dangerous. So you have a problem there. For that, 600 million people have to sacrifice things which they erroneously perhaps consider as dear to them.
You're actually raising a fascinating point because it has fairly little to do with incitement and genocide, but it has to do with the economy of scale. What we have not done up to now is show the terrorists that it's not worthwhile their time and effort to be terrorists. Nobody is doing that, and there are ways to make it unprofitable for them.
No, but you get 72 virgins in exchange for your life, which is the essence of the game. That is a purely economic calculation.
You can make that 72 virgins.
Manfred, what are you going to do with 72 females? Not even virgins.
Nachman heard virgins and he woke up.
One is enough.
The real answer, Manfred, is one virgin is the age of 70.
No, there's another joke that it's not virgins, it's Virginians.
In today's New York Times, I think it's the alliance of the Friedmans. Tom Friedman says something almost identical to what you just said before, taking the case of this Nigerian whose father. And he says that basically the problem has to be dealt with, not at the end of the terrorism, the end of the society, which needs to be reformed. So it's a problem when it continues.
Despite the similarity in our name and a little bit of a difference in spelling, Tom Friedman was never one of my favorite writers. I mean, a very small club of people who, he has a soapbox of the New York Times. He's, by the way, much more pleasant when he talks, but when he writes, I mean, I don't want to use the word vilified, but I criticized him and Jimmy Carter several times. I mean, he's a stooge he's a shill for the Saudis and stuff like that. I mean, it's absolutely irresponsible and unethical to do, but that's beside the point. The advice that he gives is easy for any commentator to have. Somehow, let's ground it back to our topic. I don't know how many of you have seen the article by Ronen Bergman in Newsweek about 3-4 weeks ago, where he said that the head of the Mossad is a major threat to Ahmadinejad, to Iran. That was the opening headline. But the last sentence was, it remains to be seen who is the greatest threat to Israel, the head of the Mossad or Iran. That's not unification and incitement, but that is absolutely irresponsible journalism. I actually sent him an email and I asked him to explain what did he try to accomplish by this kind of an irresponsible, I didn't use the word irresponsible, but by this kind of a statement. I mean, it beats me because somebody in Germany or in Belgium or in England or in Chile or anywhere picks up Newsweek and reads that. I mean, it portrays Israel as a horrible, terrible child. You know, we don't know what we're doing.
He's trying to show he's an enlightened, balanced Israeli who understands that his country is also at fault, and therefore he's just playing the same game that so many people do who are part of this world and society. Even though he wrote a very good book about it.
We have to focus in the usually he's one of the few people who knows the 1930s. And the interesting thing was that he showed the great admiration for Nazism among many people who dislike communism. And look, you have, what in the Netherlands, a socialist prime minister who in his views had sympathy for the Nazis. Then his Jewish girlfriend was cast, so he carried that with him his whole life. But that's a different story. We are in that, with all the differences between modern and post-modern society, we are in that kind of stage. We haven't, communism didn't have to be exterminated by war, therefore it didn't become so irresponsible and respectable as Nazism has become. All these people have been recycled, and they permeate society and occupy key positions. And our role is not to be the Czechoslovakia of the new wave.
I would like to thank Professor Friedmann for coming.
Thank you for taking the
I hope to see you on Monday at the movie.
Look at the movies.